Some of the things that are really important is owning your own story, being authentic. Sometimes it's like, who's your hero, who's your enemy, that story that you can certainly build in a press release. There's things like researching your industry for blind spots. We've been very successful with clients who engage me and work one-on-one, where we look at what do people talk about in your industry, but nobody seems to report it, and your trade publications don't seem to report it.
What's up, small business heroes? Welcome back to another episode of the Small Business PR Podcast. I'm super excited about today's episode because press releases is something I get asked all the time, but we still have yet to do an episode on it. So today we have the president and founder of E-Releases. It's a number one place for small businesses to get their news announcements out there. So welcome to the show, Mickie Kennedy.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So first and foremost, for people who don't really know what a press releases, can you tell us what it is?
Yeah, it's basically a third-person announcement from a company or an organization. It could be an author or a speaker, basically promoting themselves or their company. And it's transmitted to the media in hopes that they will turn it into an article or an original story. It could also be a jumping off point for requesting an interview and more information. And they're largely sent in the U.S. over a newswire. There's three major wires in the U.S., and that's PR Newswire, Business Wire, and a little less so, Globe Newswire.
So can you tell us what you mean by a newswire? Because I talk about organic media by you pitching, but what do you mean by a newswire?
Right. So, in the case of the Newswire, these are organizations that have set up feeds that go directly to certain newsrooms. In other cases, there's logins for journalists to go in, and they can really tailor the type of feeds. So, if you cover, say, fashion as a journalist, you can get in there and create filters so that press releases that maybe mention ready to wear or certain retailers, you can exclude those. And you can also do inclusions so that you can capture the types of press releases that are more likely to be relevant to what your beat is as a journalist. And the newswires are a really good way to get your content out broadly, but they don't replace pitching and PR firms and the services that they provide. It's just a supplemental tool that sometimes a journalist, a PR firm will pay the extra money to have a release go over the wire because they think that it might resonate with a more general audience.
Yeah. So for my audience of small business entrepreneurs, they've heard of me writing these. I do this on my VIP day when I do a lot of whether it's someone who raised money or maybe they have a new product, right? It's what I call like owned media. So it's coming from the voice of the company who's writing it. But I think for me, especially in the age that we're in now, it's really about the SEO power. So every major company and any legitimate company I Google, if you click on the news tab of Google, you'll probably see their press release. So can you tell me about another reason why people should consider press releases, even though they're not like a NASDAQ listed company?
That's right. So I think that in a lot of cases, it's the ability of leverage. And for example, if you have a really hot press release, and we did one a little over a year ago for an initiative during the pandemic to help restaurants that were closed down, we stopped counting at 150 media pickups. It got picked up by Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times. All the food trade publications picked it up, and over 30 newspapers ended up running with it. And it was something because of the initiative being very short-lived and needing to get out the message now, and it being very timely. And also there was a lot of negative news about the pandemic and things like that. Here was something that was positive. Here was something that the average person could actually help out their local restaurant that's closed. And so, I'm not surprised it did so well. To have done that through direct pitches would have been much more difficult. And there were some direct pitches that were done with it, but those numbers are much smaller than that broad leverage that you potentially could get. Now that's an extreme example. I've only had 2 press releases ever do that successful. On average, a really good press release might get between 4 to maybe 6 media pickups per successful press release. And usually they're doing a campaign of several releases. I always recommend that if you're going to test press releases, to do a campaign of 6 to 8 press releases, trying different strategic approaches and being strategic, and what you're trying to send out, in the hopes that you can see whether the media will engage with you.
Yeah, I love that. I think leverage is important, and I also think there's something to be said about writing in the position of the actual company, right? Because when you do pitch to an editor or a journalist, it's their editorial discretion how they want to do the story, but there's nothing as powerful and as authoritative as your company announcement. So, for anyone that's listening, we're really talking about something that's a little bit more time sensitive, whether you're launching, you're announcing, you have funding, you have a celebrity spokesperson. I mean, something that's very specific, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the more specific you can be, the better. I think that some of the things that are really important is owning your own story, being authentic. Sometimes it's like, who's your hero, who's your enemy. That story that you can certainly build in a press release. There's things like researching your industry for blind spots. We've been very successful with clients who engage me and work one-on-one, where we look at what do people talk about in your industry, but nobody seems to report it, and your trade publications don't seem to report it. In some cases, there's a reason for it, but in a lot of cases, it's just an opportunity. It's a gap. And if you come in with that conversation, a lot of the trade publications will often pick it up, and it'll do very well. Other things that work very well are surveys and studies. I've never had anyone do a survey or study with my coaching and not get media pickup. And in general, it's usually between 6 and 12, maybe as many as 14 original articles coming from one survey. And I know a survey sounds really daunting, and I always encourage people that it's not a lot of work. It's developing the survey questions, putting them in something like SurveyMonkey, and then getting the link and sharing it with an audience. And a lot of people get hung up on that part, but it's easy to partner with a trade association. A small or independent trade association in your industry would probably very likely send it to their members, especially if you say, I'm doing a release over the wire and I'll mention you as part of the survey. And so it creates a win-win. It actually stacks your credibility when you're doing the press release as well, to be tied to that trade association. And you'll likely get a lot more results and have it more interesting. I always suggest that you throw in a couple oddball left field questions. You can put them towards the end, but sometimes those are the ones that yield the most surprising results, and really go viral with the media.
So, can you give me an example? I know you talked earlier about the kind of restaurant pandemic recovery. What are some of the other survey based ones that did really well?
So we did a survey for an auto repair shop in Pennsylvania. They came through with from an SEO guy who said, we need to get auto industry trade links fast, because they had a new website. Their old website went dark and they couldn't recover it. And so they had a new domain name and they wanted to get rankings. And they said, since you're in the automotive industry, auto industry trade links would do very well. So I told them the only way that I could think to get media pickup would be doing a survey. And so they partnered with the Independent Auto Repair Trade Association. I think they got almost 800 responses. And in there, we asked, what's the strangest thing a person left in their car while being repaired? Now, the results were not statistically relevant, but they went viral. It was every story that they got was about that question, and the odd little responses that we got. We left enough room to write 2 or 3 sentences, and we just got all these really interesting anecdotes. A boa constrictor, grandma left in an urn, and they had to retrieve her after hours for memorial service. Just lots of little quirky things like that. And from a fascination standpoint, why the media responded to it. They were great little quips and things that happened. And so those questions came towards the end. I always recommend that you break up your survey multi-page, so that if someone stops the survey mid-process, you still have their results from the first half that they did. And towards the end, you can throw out some little strange questions and things like that. And it's also a way to brand you as well. At the very end, you could send them to your website. You could send them to your about page. You could talk a little bit about who you are as the author of the survey, and you just got in front of, in that case, 800 other auto repair shops in the US that might be valuable for networking purposes.
Wow, there's so much. I hope whoever's listening, you're taking notes because Mickey is dropping some real gems. So you said so many things about leveraging data, being wacky, a little whimsical, because that's what how people go viral, and then also partnering with a trade organization. So I know for me, a lot of my there were female founders or mompreneurs. So for example, with like a military wives association, would that be like a good partner?
I think, yeah, I think anywhere that you feel an affinity towards that group, that group represents part of your potential customer base, is a really strong place for you to be able to get those opinions. And right now is a really great time to take a survey in any industry because there's a lot of flux right now. We're coming out of a pandemic. I hope, how do people feel? Are they spending more in advertising, or are they taking a wait and see approach? Are they spending less? How's their hiring? We've heard so much about the job market being very difficult. Questions about that would be very timely, so that if you did a release that touched on several of those subjects and came up with some responses and some great analytical results that you sort of maybe put in quotes or things like that, I could see that do very well in almost any industry. And the thing about it is, it only lives for a short time. So if you were to take that survey in 6 months, that new survey would be very relevant for the same reasons, because we're moving and evolving, and we really don't know, without taking our temperature at several different times, how the industry feels about a certain thing. And that's why I think surveys are so valuable, and they're so repeatable, because just because you took a survey today doesn't mean that in 6 months the same questions would be answered the same way.
Yeah, I mean, survey and data, it puts you a step above because it not only does the legwork for the journalist who's not going to be doing that, it automatically establishes you as an expert more than the other person who's pitching without data. And so a lot of times people ask me, well, how do I get people to do a survey? You can offer $5 Starbucks card on LinkedIn, but this is actually genius because I can just write to the association.
Right. Yeah, the small independent trade associations, they don't get the love that the large ones do. So if you approach them and just say, send out my link, and I will mention you in the press release I'm doing, that works like 80% of the time. And then the remaining part of the time, you may have to be creative. I've had a few clients who they ended up co-branding the survey so that they got equal billing for it. But again, I said, you're stacking your credibility. That I don't see that as diminishing any bit, that you're not the sole author of the survey.
Yeah, I love that. So there's so many different types of press releases, which is something that the company or yourself that you issue. Can you kind of just do a quick rundown of the different types of press releases?
Right. So um, let me just see. I think I have a page on my website I would just like to throw out if I can find it. It's ereleases.com/ideas. And it runs through a lot of like the typical types of releases that we see: a new or updated product or service, partnership with another company or organization, speaking or presenting at a major event. Of course, winning an award is always good, or being singled out for an accomplishment. Community involvement is something that I wished worked more. I see a lot of really creative and cool stuff that organizations are doing with their communities, and when unfortunately, those press releases I don't see get a lot of media pickup. And for the same reasons, I think sponsorships and charitable contributions don't do very well with press releases. Other types of ones that I see: office relocation or expanded facilities. We did a lot of press releases during the pandemic of companies basically wanting to speak to their industry and to their potential customers and existing customers that we're still in business, and this is how we're pivoting. We're able to fulfill your needs, and if there are any changes in the workflow, they might make them in the press release. So it's very important for them to communicate that, and they felt a press release was a really good way to do it, so that people doing searches for them, especially in Google News and stuff like that, would find them. A patent filing is something, or being awarded a patent is something that could be really valuable, especially among trade publications. They seem to do really well with that because they talk about the implications of the patent and how it could be used. free information, a teleclass, a seminar, a white paper that you have. Those are also opportunities. But again, I think if you write the press release too much like you're just looking for leads, you could turn off the journalist. So it's very subtle how you have to bridge something like that. I think I mentioned to you before we began that I had a client in the security business, and he basically just had a checklist for small e-commerce companies, and it was very informational, and he did very well with that because he wasn't leading with that. He was leading about, this is a problem in the industry, and are you aware of whether you have the same vulnerabilities? If so, here's a checklist that we recommend. And I think positioning like that, it does very well. But there's basically press releases on probably over 100 different things that you could do, arranging from celebrity endorsement to stock offering, trade show exhibits, trends, expert opinions. And I love expert opinions for my clients, because so many people have sort of an imposter syndrome and they don't want to get out there as an expert. I'm like, but you say you've been in the business for 30 years and you know everything. And they're like, well, yeah, I would agree with that. And I said, well, you are an expert. And so once we overcome that, they're much more willing to put their positions out there. And I always recommend, taking an audit of your positions in your market. And are there areas where you differ from what the majority says? And if you do, that's a great way to be the friendly jerk, or AKA the contrarian, where you're positioning something and giving the other side to what most people are usually seeing. And for that reason, if you are the person with a rational argument as to why you're contrarian on a particular subject, you stand the chance of every time a journalist in your industry writes about that subject, that you could be included, because a journalist wants to cover both sides of an argument. And if you're the only one speaking on the con side of something like that, you're much more likely to be that go-to person for discussing that.
Yes, and I always say this in my PR masterclass is like, they want to interview experts, right? And experts have a point of view. It doesn't mean you need to be controversial just to ruffle feathers, but you probably have an insight that you don't always agree with what the other gurus are teaching. What about, okay, so this is another thing is what about predictions? Making a prediction about something.
Predictions work really well. I find that they do extremely well towards the end of the year and beginning of the new year, because it's just like, I don't know, there's something about the calendar cycle that people like to have. They're more open to ideas and outlooks about certain things at those times, and I think that you can do really well with those.
Yeah, I love that. I always say end of the year is a great time to do an end of the year recap. So like trends, things like that. And the beginning of the year is a great way to do predictions, right? So like
Right.
5 hot beauty, clean beauty ingredients, things like that. We have a lot of beauty and wellness entrepreneurs, but also even if you're service based, right? It might be personal development tools or anything. So there's so many ideas. I'm gonna have to actually rewind because you just gave us so many good ideas that there's like
Right.
light
And
bulbs
speaking of
popping.
ideas, anytime you can number something, like top 10 works really well. Top five also works, but top tens of anything works well. So if you have top 10 predictions, it just makes it so much easier for the journalist to consume it and write it, because so many features and articles are around top 10 lists and things like that.
Yeah, top 10 wellness trends, top 10 parenting things, top 10 homeschool remedy. I mean, we could just go on for hours about this, which brings me to my next question is, obviously I teach an organic, pitching method, and I really see press releases as a tool. And I always say, don't put the press release on the newswire. You want to save it and kind of shop it around, and you almost use it as like a kind of like a carrot and say, see if anyone bites on it. And then if you can offer a journalist an exclusive, preferably, at a top tier outlet, then you would time the press release to go out at the same time they write a story. So can you kind of unpack what that process is? Because a lot of people don't really understand that the nuance of that.
Right. So when you're providing an exclusive to someone, you're basically saying, "I want you to have first dibs at going to press with this story," and there is a value to it, and they do value it because it makes them stand out because they're going to be the first, and they're going to it's probably going to attract more people who are going to check out the story, and it's going to create more waves. Whoever sort of promoted it first and published it first. And so if you are doing the press release and you're looking for getting exclusive, yeah, you definitely want to do that yourself or have someone who handles your media contacts reach out to someone and offer it to them as an exclusive. And then once they've published it and given you a publishing date, then you could send out the release subsequent to that. And what a lot of people will find is that after that initial launch, the press release will result in really good pickup generally as a result of that. Other places will pick it up. I always people worry about with exclusives like, well, if this person got the exclusive, everyone else is going to not want to do the story because they didn't get there first. And the real truth is news, and all of these journalists are trying to produce really good content. And if they see really great content on another website and then they see a press release that they can work from, it makes it easy for them to pull a similar, develop a similar story. And I think that that's not going to hurt you. It actually helps you by getting that initial exclusive.
Exactly. I always say, well, there's a couple of things because a lot of people always stop themselves and say, well, what if I have more than one person who wants an exclusive? And I'm like, that's a great problem to have. If more than one person wants to date you, that's a good problem to have, And it's only going to make you more valuable. So let's say, so for example, I did a press release years ago for this really bootstrapping, like pre-seed fintech, and we got Financial Times to do the exclusive. Now, according to what you're saying, is like, well, somebody already covered it, nobody else wants to. But then we ended up getting them on Wall Street Journal and New York Times and CNBC. So I'm validating what you're saying is that just because somebody wants to cover it, it doesn't mean that's like, oh, it's done now. Right? It's only going to make it even
Right.
more
And you can
powerful.
also sort of couch your exclusivity by country. For example, when I worked
Mm.
at a telecom research institute about 28 years ago, and that's what got me into press releases. We would do exclusives with, I think, like The Economist, Financial Times, but we would just give them, other countries. We would say domestically, we're not going to give you an exclusive, but we'll give you international exclusivity.
That's awesome. And it could just be in a very simple email, right? Like, hey, we're
Absolutely.
announcing this. You're our top choice outlet. Let me know if you'd like me to send you the embargoed press release.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So embargoed, for anyone that's listening, it just means that it's kind of a you're agreeing not to kind of release it. And honestly, unless you're doing, salacious celebrity gossip or some kind of political news, I don't think your people are going to be releasing it. Is there something else that people should know about kind of using a press release as a tool to start connections and conversations with journalists who otherwise might not give them a time of day?
Well, I think that there's it. It's not easy to get media pickup from press releases, and I think I mentioned to you that before we began that a statistic that I hate is that 95% of the press releases that we issue at E-Releases result in nothing other than syndication of the press release on various websites, but it doesn't result in earned media. And I think that so many reasons why that is because the stories that they're telling aren't compelling. They are approaching it in the me approach rather than what's in it for the journalist. The journalist, you got to realize, is a gatekeeper, and what can you do to make their job easier so that they would find you irresistible and want to share you with their audience. And if you can approach the release from that standpoint, I think you're going to end up with a product that does much more favorably when you do issue it over a wire and out to the media. There are other things that you can keep in mind, just knowing how the media sort of works. If you're going to have a quote in the press release, make it really compelling. Make it so that if they were to paraphrase that quote, there would be a loss to the press release or the story. And so many people don't write. They write safe language and just safe quotes, and they don't really stand out. So I've had a client inspire a story, and a journalist writes the story, and then the managing editor cuts that business, that company, out of the press release. And he didn't realize that they inspired the story, but what he just saw was, here's a company that I don't know, and the only quote in there was really weak, and so I cut them. And if there had been a small unknown company in there with a really great quote, the managing editor probably would have just put an exclamation mark in the margin saying "great quote" and let it run. So you do yourself a disservice by playing it safe. If you want to be artistic or creative, the quote is a really great place to put something that's so succinct and compelling and really interesting. And I recommend people spend a lot of time with that and the headline, what it is you're pitching, and what that
Yes.
headline says.
I love that you said that because when I do press release writing for, on my VIP days, and I always say that because of press release, you do charge more if you go over the word count, which I'm glad you do because it teaches people to be succinct because it takes a lot more skill to say things in a more concise way. So I'm glad there actually is, like a limit. But a lot of people do play it safe and they really waste the precious real estate of that quote by saying something like, I am so proud of this announcement. And like nothing's worse than that, right? So
Right.
think about like how
Absolutely.
you can position yourself as different. Or I always like to say like, what is a problem and why are you in a unique position to solve this particular problem?
Yeah. I think that's really good.
So now let's get into the nitty gritty of like the actual press release writing, because I think a lot of people think there's this like really formal, official way of doing it and it has to look a certain way. Do you agree with that?
I do not. And I'm coming to you as someone who over 10 years ago wrote the beginner's guide to writing powerful press releases. I really felt that having the best well-written press release was the answer to getting media pickup. And I learned over time that it matters not too much. The newswire used to be stringent at AP style, and now if you sent a press release that was all cap headline, there's a chance they would run it like that because they're not really adhering to those standards anymore. I think that we've become more relaxed in language and expectations. Microsoft Word does a really good job of checking grammar and punctuation for a lot of people. And I think that rather than being tripped up on the perfect type of press release, I think what you should really do is just sort of build your argument, what it is you're announcing and why you matter. And, sort of try to reverse engineer from what a journalist would be looking for. How are you compelling? How are you answering that person's questions and giving them something that they just want to share with their audience? And I think that that approach will yield a better press release than taking a template or looking at some competitor's press release. So many press releases are just written by press releases that they see that are already out there and say, "Oh, let me just make this mine by changing the industry or making a couple of tweaks here." And what they really should be doing is, rather than deciding that's the press release you want to do, what is something more strategic that you could be doing? Yeah, like the survey that we talked about, or
Yeah.
anything along those lines. Yeah, newsjacking is one of those things that people always talk about, but I find it fail miserably so many times. That's where you just jump on a trending news story and enter your opinion and on that. And I've had success with people who do newsjacking when they elevate the conversation or make it very specific to a specific subgroup. And so that if you can elevate a conversation by drawing more nuance within it, or focusing on one's very narrow audience that's affected by that news, you're going to open yourself up to media that want to basically enlarge the conversation, and sometimes that's by making it smaller and more niche oriented.
Yes, I always say in terms of finding your angle is peeling the layers of an onion. The top one is the most obvious COVID pandemic one. Let's get beneath that. Maybe we cry a little bit, but let's peel the onion and talk about how it affects a certain specific subset of people, whether it's moms or moms with autistic kids or whatever it is, right? So I really love what you said about it. We're not reinventing the conversation. Everything is a remix. But what is your one piece, was your tiny little puzzle piece that without it the conversation's not complete?
Right. And I know in marketing, I've come across the USP, which is unique selling proposition. What is it that you do that's so unique? And I think that even from a PR standpoint, you have to really hone what your USP is. And if you don't have one, if you're not doing something different than everybody else in your industry, then maybe you should try to create one and refine what your USP is to differentiate yourself, because a differentiated company is going to have an easier chance at getting media attention because they stand out as being different and odd. And about a third of the people that appear on Shark Tank do releases through e-releases to announce their episode. The producers tell them to promote it through a press release beforehand. And I think the reason those work so well is, yes, it's a national show that people seem to like and love of startups. But I think the reason these companies get picked is because they're doing something a little different than everyone else. It's we often are surprised and captivated with what that company is doing, what they're launching, what they're selling, how they're selling it. It's unique, and I think that if you can sort of refine your USP and develop that, then you stand a stronger chance of differentiating yourself and getting media attention. You have to remember, journalists don't like promoting big giant companies. Rather than do an article on Microsoft or Google, they would much rather you be seen as a curator, picking some obscure company or startup that no one knows about and really highlighting what they're doing and why they're doing something that matters and what's different about them.
I love that. I love that you just validate the fact that journalism is not dead. It's not like it's just the influencer of the week who gets free product or the Microsofts of the world. But I do think there is a trick, and I do teach this as well in my master classes. You can name drop, right? And you can mention maybe what Microsoft is doing that's not as good as what you're doing. I don't think Microsoft is necessarily going to come after you.
Sure. No, I don't think so. And I think that a lot of times you can just talk about, industry standard products and services and not even mention the competitor, and everyone knows who it is. So,
Mhm.
there's ways of accomplishing it. And I think that anything that you do that makes you unique is fodder for PR. And, you just have to get behind it and communicate it in a way that they'll understand it and see why there's a story there.